Working, yes. Thank you very much for coming to this press conference of the United Nations Environment Programme. We're here to, in a sense, hand over a report called Bridging the Gap, which is a report produced with many, many experts from around the world on where the world actually is right now in terms of an emissions gap, the difference between scientific reality and ambition. I'm Nick Nuttall. I'm the spokesperson for the UN Environment Programme. What I'd like to do first is to ask Achim Steiner, UN Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of UNEP, to briefly introduce this press conference, why we're here, what we're doing, and then hand the report on to the Deputy Minister for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa, Mr. Ibrahim, and then we'll work our way through the panel. Thank you.
Excellencies, Ministers, delegates and members of the media, thank you for joining us here this morning. This report was launched before the Durban COP, but we, at the request of many of the parties, were asked to also have a formal handover here to the COP presidency in South Africa. I believe the case for doing so is manifold, but two things in particular led us to convene also this press conference here this morning. First of all, this conference of the parties has been under intense scrutiny by the world's public and by the world's media in terms of its relevance and its ability to make a difference. In so doing, we need to, first of all, understand how far the world has come in terms of acting on climate change, and part of that is being addressed in this emissions gap report. The world, often in scrutinizing the lack of progress in terms of targets and imperatives to act, tends to overlook that, in fact, a great deal is happening in the world today in addressing climate change. And that report that we have called Bridging the Gap report is in part an attempt to try and capture both these voluntary commitments, which particularly since Copenhagen have been the greatest hope of the world to maintain its progress towards addressing climate change, and how far these commitments have and are taking us in terms of the 2-degree target. The report is no different than this COP and previous climate change negotiations in that it is both a glass half full and a glass half empty. However, we have both just come out of a symposium that President Zuma this morning has convened with Nobel laureates. And I think this is the critical message that we need to keep on reminding the world at every stage of this process. Climate change and climate change negotiations are defined in the first instance by science and scientific realities, not by politics, not by political expediency, not by political impasse. And therefore here in Durban, this Bridging the Gap report is trying to provide the world with a set of first principles by which it can continue to assess whether the world is, first of all, on a trajectory in terms of its commitments, voluntary or otherwise, in even coming close to meeting the science in the sense of how it is explaining global warming to us today and the scenarios it has provided us. But, and this is a difference to last year's report that we produced for the COP in Cancun, Mexico, to also try and assess what are the options for the world to move forward today and still stay within a 2-degree scenario. We also want to emphasize again this morning in handing over this report that, notwithstanding the many discussions that are now ongoing inside the COP, in the corridors and in the global public media space about the timelines for reaching an agreement, that based on the latest evidence, and this evidence I want to emphasize again was produced literally and concluded days before this negotiation. It is the latest available information that we have on how the world is doing in terms of carbon emissions, that we have no reason to lean back because, in fact, as the WMO already indicated, carbon emissions are at their highest. The gap that we assessed last year has, if anything, grown slightly, not shrunk, between what we need to achieve and what the world is likely to achieve. And thirdly, that not only is, and this is a part that we have added this year, is the world able to, in fact, make these transitions. And, this report, alongside the report of the World Meteorological Organization, alongside the report of the International Energy Agency, alongside the report of the OECD as the world's, let's say, industrialized countries' leading think tank on economics, are essentially all saying the same thing, the world has an ever narrower window of time in which it can try and make these transitions happen. It can choose to do so, according to the IEA, in a 5-year window. According to the climate change process that we have here, in terms of reaching the 44 gigaton target by 2020. And the OECD has also in its report indicated that addressing these issues and staying within a 2-degree scenario would, over a period up to 2050, mean that we only lose 0.2% of annual GDP growth, taking a 3.5% average. 0.2% to enable the world to stay within a 2-degree target. The science tells us that it is essential and imperative. The economics tells us that it is doable. The politics, in terms of how we are negotiating at the moment, is in terms of this report saying to us, we are not moving fast enough. So that, in essence, ladies and gentlemen, is the set of messages that accompany this Bridging the Gap report. It is both a reason for people to be optimistic because we can still achieve that 2-degree scenario, but it is also yet another dramatic reminder that we are losing time, that we are not heading in the right direction in overall terms, despite all the excellent initiatives that are underway. And I end by simply saying, neither at this COP nor at future COPs is the issue one of voluntary versus legally binding agreements. The two condition each other. That is also one of the results of this report here. You cannot rely on voluntary actions alone. But while you're trying to find a legally binding agreement, voluntary actions have in fact been one of the greatest, let's say, motors for progress, because they prove that countries at national level, at local level, are perfectly capable of acting. But in order to achieve the kinds of transitions we are talking about here, do not let these two sets of actions be put into competition or as alternatives to each other. One requires the other and vice versa. That is why the world is once again here in Durban with all countries represented. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Steiner. As we all know, these press conferences, they're 30 minutes. The UN Framework Convention are very strict on that, so we have to move at a rapid pace now, a bit like what we need to do with climate change. So what I'd like you to do, Mr. Steiner, is to stand up and hand over to the Deputy Minister from South Africa the Emissions Gap Report. Thank you very much indeed. Deputy Minister, I understand you have some remarks prepared.
Yes, thank you very much, Your Excellencies and the media. On behalf of the government of the South African government, I would like to thank UNEP for undertaking this most valuable work. The Bridging the Emission Gap assessment has already been informing many of the discussions here in Durban, and is serving an important role in providing robust, independent information to inform the climate negotiations at this critical time. The warning presented in this report is clear. Our current commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are not enough to keep us on a secure pathway to a long-term climate protection. There is a substantial gap between what we have promised to do and what is required if we are to protect ourselves, our economies, and our environment from dangerous increase in global warming. The report has particularly importance for the governments and the people of Africa, many of whom will be among the most vulnerable in the impact of climate change. Bad news is that we have more to do and less time to do it in. The gap between current commitment to reduce emissions and the reduction we need by 2020 is larger than reported last year, and we now have 1 year less to bridge this gap. Good news is that we already know what to do and we can afford to do it. No major technological breakthrough are needed and the costs are not prohibitive. A wide range of successful policy instruments are available and have already been implemented in many different sectors and countries throughout the world, including here in South Africa. The emission gap can be bridged if we target our energy system using more non-fossil fuel and renewable energy sources and making significant improvement in energy efficiency. Put in place strong long-term sector-specific policies to achieve the full emissions potential of the different economic sectors. To conclude, do we need to bridge the emission gap by 2020? The answer is, of course, yes. Is it technically possible to bridge the emission gap by 2020? The answer again is yes. Is it economically feasible to bridge the emission gap by 2020? Answer again is yes. Do we know how to bridge the emission gap by 2020? Answer again is yes. Will we bridge the emission gap by 2020? We must. Our future depends on it. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd now like to ask Carl Hood, Minister of Foreign Affairs for Grenada, to address the press conference.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Excellencies, members of the head table, ladies and gentlemen, press, I'm honored to be a part of this very important launching of this very important report, which, to my mind, requires the urgent attention of this conference. I've always been a firm believer that good policy have to be backed up by sound analysis, and this report provides a very solid base for urgently addressing the question of mitigation ambition here in Durban. I am impressed by the rigors of the methodologies that have been used and by the pragmatism of the recommendations, and even more so by the fact that these recommendations are based on the actual experiences of countries and are neither theoretical nor hypothetical. Mr. Chairman, the report carries three main messages, each of which is important for this conference. The first message is that there is an urgent problem with greenhouse gas emissions which requires action now. The gap is growing. We are very far from reaching our 2 degrees goal, and therefore urgent action is needed. This action has to be sufficiently aggressive to allow global emission to peak well before 2020, so that we do not get locked out of that 2 degrees and possibly the 1.5 degrees goal, which as AOSIS we have been clamoring for. So this is the first message. Action is needed now, not next year, not 2015, not 2020. Now, the second message is that there are existing solutions to the problem which are tried and tested. What this means is that there is no excuse for delay, no reason for inaction, no reason for not starting immediately. This leads me to the third message, that now is a time for concrete action, not for workshops, not for studies again, not for processes, but for specific action aimed at increasing the level of ambition and closing the gap. I want to thank UNEP for this very important work, for it's a timely release, and I would undertake here in Durban to ensure that the findings of this report are discussed at the political levels within our group AOSIS. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And now over to Chris Hume, UK Secretary of State of the Department of Energy and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, and I very much welcome this report, and I'd like to thank UNEP and the authors and ACIM for making sure that this very important piece of research is there and on track. I think it's a really key prelude to the last stage of the negotiations here at Durban. It's crucial to building understanding around the impact of the current pledges and of what further action is needed. And the report makes clear that looking at 2020, existing pledges will only deliver at most half of what is needed to close the gap to a 2-degree trajectory. And it also makes clear that closing the gap is still within our grasp. So there's more than enough global emissions reduction potential using existing technologies to close the gap, but realising this potential will require political will across all countries and a step up in global mitigation action to ensure that global emissions peak before 2020. And that's absolutely key, what is coming out of the science, as Akim said. You can negotiate about all sorts of things, you can politically posture about all sorts of things, but the science is non-negotiable. And we will have to deal with the consequences as humanity if we fail to respect what the science is warning us will be the consequences. So here at COP17 in Durban, we therefore need first to make progress in reaching a common understanding in the negotiations on the size of the gap and how we can close it. And we have to make progress towards a global, legally binding deal which commits all major economies to binding targets to lower their emissions. Obviously, we want in Europe to see the continuation of the Kyoto rules and architecture. But at the same time, we also recognise in Europe that this alone is not enough. We need to see a framework which involves all the parties, and this is the only way we're going to meet our 2-degree objective. Third, we must press for a framework of common accounting rules so that we have a consistency in how we measure emissions and ensure the environmental integrity of the system. Common rules and accounting rules are core to ensuring that the pledges add up and there is confidence and transparency in the system overall. And finally, we need to develop the guidelines for reporting emissions and develop the processes for verification. This is key so that we can track our progress in tackling climate change. The UK, with our European partners, we're playing our part. Within the UK, we have just set a 4th carbon budget to cover the period 2023 to 2027, representing a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases compared with 1990. And our recently published carbon plan sets out our plans to achieve this and to put us on a credible pathway to 2050. We're also determined that we should play our part in helping the developing world to meet the challenges of climate change, and that's why we've provided £2.9 billion in our current comprehensive spending review period in climate finance to support action in developing countries. But this is an urgent problem. We are putting our money where our mouth is. We're determined that we should get action. Along with our European partners, we are in the vanguard of those pressing for a legally binding agreement which is really going to bite and respect the science. Absolutely key. We don't have much time left.
Thank you. And finally, I believe that the Minister from Mexico is in Johannesburg, but we're very delighted to have the Director General of the National Forestry Commission, Juan Manuel Torres Rocco, who's joined us as a surprise package at the end. And last year we did the Gigaton Gap report, and that informed the Cancun meeting. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. We, in behalf of the Mexican government, I would like to say that we really welcome this report. We believe that this report says that we are not doing enough in order to keep the world as we know it so far. And there are very good recommendations about what we have to do in the short run in order to complete some of the goals that we need to do as soon as possible to keep the world as we know it. What is very interesting in this report is that it's very specific in some of the areas where some of the sectors where we could be very efficient in reducing these emissions. And what it calls my attention is that some of these sectors have dual purposes in terms of not only reducing emissions, but also in order to increase the welfare of many people that is living in rural areas. Basically, the forestry sector, the agricultural sectors are the sectors where we could be very, very efficient in reducing emissions. Other point that is very relevant in the report is basically the need to reach some sort of agreements, and there are a wide variety of agreements that we could reach. I think it's a very good display of many options. We don't have to get merry. We don't have to stick in one of specific option for each one of the problems. It's a very wide variety of options. I think it's a very good report. As I said, we welcome the report, and thank you for all the people who participated in elaborating this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I think the Deputy Minister was planning on leaving right now because you had an urgent meeting, sir. Okay. Whilst the Deputy Minister is going, we have a really, really short time. So quick questions and very quick answers from the panel. Who would like to go first from the media? Yes, Vanya, over there. Microphone.
Do I have to stand up?
No.
Thank you. My question is...
Oh, apparently you do have to stand up.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm not photogenic. I hate standing up. My question is both for Dr. Hakim and for the Honourable Secretary of State. Your findings seem to go counter to the reasoning of the American delegation, who told us last week that the voluntary targets set in Cancun would not be modified in his view, and they didn't need to be modified because there was plenty of time after 2020 to find pathways to reach 2 degrees. So, Dr. Steiner, have you presented this report to the American delegation, and if so, what are they saying about it? And Secretary of State, have you had a dialogue with the Americans? And if you fail to convince them here, what do you intend to do during next year about this?
Right. Quick answers, gentlemen.
We are in constant contact with many delegations, but this report was presented to the international community. I have not yet handed a copy as such, but I know that the American delegation, like most others in this COP, have studied this report carefully. I think the question that you've asked is one that you have to direct to the US delegation. Our responsibility is, but in terms of asking me, I can only say to you, we have brought together the world's leading climate modeling centers, experts, peer-reviewed this. We are trying to provide the global public with the most honest and best possible assessment of where we are at. These are the facts insofar as we know them today. I want to point also to Joseph Alcamo, our chief scientist, who with a number of the authors and representatives of the centers are here today. Individual delegations' responses to this report are the privilege of those delegations. The facts insofar as we have assembled are here for all to see, to scrutinize, and then to determine whether they speak correctly to the reality or not. And I think the bottom line is, validated by the other reports I've mentioned, the more you triangulate where we are at, the clearer it is that the window of opportunity is narrowing, and that both in technological, scientific and economic terms, the time is not on our side. And that is, I think, an uncontested reality in terms of the facts we have presented.
I'll be meeting Todd Stern soon, and I'll very much put that point to him. I think it is key that we, particularly those of us who've had a long-standing tradition of respecting what the science is telling us, those of us who are sort of founded on making sure that our public debate is anchored in some sort of reality, that we do recognise that the clock is ticking, that there is a relatively limited window. And we've set out very clearly in the European Union what we think that window is. We think that we need to get global emissions coming down by 2020, and we think that that means that we need to get an international agreement that's legally binding on all the parties by 2015. Now, there may be some wiggle room around that, but not much, because this really is, as the UNEP report makes very clear, we have an ongoing problem where we're not meeting the goals that we've set ourselves, and we need to make sure that we do.
I'm sorry, I have to close the press conference because we've run out of time. Literally, we are at 1 minute before the next press conference starts, so we have to be honest. But if there are any questions for the panel as they rush out of the main door, then I'm sure they're happy to take them. So I think we need to move. Yes.